So there's 24 hours in a day. There are 60 minutes in an hour. There are 60 seconds in a minute. How do you spend your time? I mean, really, how do you spend the time you have? Are you good at time management? Are you making the most of your time? Have you ever heard anybody ask you those questions? I mean, if you're like in a job interview, how do you do with time management? You know, they might ask you those kinds of things because how we manage our time and how we use our time can be a very important aspect of who we are as people. Being good time managers, valuing our time, not wasting our time. Those are things that we learn from an easy age. Stop wasting your time, right? Well, I got to thinking about that a lot. And I know that sometimes when I begin to think of time and this idea of not wasting my time, I find myself often thinking, okay, how am I doing today? Am I being productive? Am I keeping myself busy enough? Am I doing what I need to do with this time that I have? Because I know that I have a limited amount of time. And all this thought about time can really start to make me really anxious about it. Well, then during a devotional time, I ran across these verses from Ephesians chapter 5. And I'll tell you, it brought my anxiety level up even more. And I don't know, maybe it was just because of how these scriptures hit me, and maybe I'm taking these scriptures out of context, but I'll tell you, when I read it, this is how it hit me. It says this, it says, "Be careful then how you live, not as unwise people, but as wise, making the most of the time because the days are evil." Making the most of your time. And so, you know, it's interesting. I'm reading that in my devotional time, and I read this verse and it says, make the most of your time. And I started thinking to myself, you know, what am I doing wasting my time sitting here reading the Bible? I need to get busy. I got things to do. I got stuff to study for. I got plans to make. I mean, and then I stopped and I listened to myself, and I started to think, wait a minute. It doesn't say get really busy, spend every second of your day being frantic about what you're doing. It says make the most of the time. Make the most of the time. How do we make the most of our time? You know, there's a passage of scripture that has become real familiar to many folks when it talks about how we use our time or how we find times of rest in our life. It's the story of Mary and Martha, and you may have heard the story. I know Allie preached on this story a while back during our last sermon series. But the idea is that there's these two sisters, and they invite Jesus to their house, and Martha is doing all the things that need to be done in the kitchen. She's trying to get things ready. We presume she's getting food ready. She's setting stuff up so that Jesus and his disciples can have a nice dinner together. But Mary, her sister, is, instead of helping her in the kitchen, she's sitting there with Jesus. And Martha comes up to Jesus and she says, "Can you please tell my sister," essentially what he says is, "Can you please tell my sister to get in there and help me, because I'm sitting here doing all the work and she's doing nothing but sitting there." And Jesus says to her, "Oh, Martha, you are so worried about so many things." She is making, essentially he says, she's making the most of her time. And she's just sitting there. And all of a sudden it started to occur to me, you know what? Making the most of my time means recognizing that time is precious and how I spend it is important, but that could mean that the most important thing I can do is to have my quiet time, or to sit with Melanie and have a conversation, or to go visit someone who's not feeling well, or to just sit by myself for a minute and reflect on what God's doing in my life. You see, making most of my time doesn't always mean having a full calendar. It's recognizing that the time we have can be more relational than it is task-oriented. And I think sometimes that's where we get really messed up. We think in our minds that making the most of our time means accomplishing more tasks in a day, when sometimes it simply means being as relational as possible with the time you have. There's a lot of things that are going on in our world. And using our time wisely could be much more relational than it is in any other way that we might define that time. So I wrote a couple things down for myself. And these, maybe we call these New Year's resolutions, I don't know. But I said, the key for me as I look at this whole issue of time is, instead of trying to stay busy, what I want to do is I want to try to be more intentional with my time. Rather than feeling scattered as if I'm trying to get all kinds of things done, like I'm juggling so many different tasks at a time, maybe what I need to do is spend a little more time being focused on that one thing that I'm doing in that moment. And rather than kind of being accidental in the ways in which I relate to people or the way in which I spend my time, I need to be more deliberate. I need to set time aside to recognize that if I am scattered, if I am busy, if I don't understand that this time I have is so important, I'm going to miss some of the best things in life. Essentially, that, I think, is what Jesus was saying to Martha. She's doing the best with her time right now that she possibly can. So, yes, time is a precious commodity, and we need to be careful with how we spend our time. But we need to be driven by something very different, perhaps, than what the world's trying to drive us towards, what these things are trying to drive us towards. And be sure that we take the time we need to use that time very wisely.